Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Gardens, Smithsonian Gardens weekly webinar series, where we talk about all things related to gardening and animals and habitat. So welcome, we're happy to have you here today. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, so please accept the recording. I'd also like to mention that I have a co-host today, Sarah Dickert. She's a lead horticulturist for Smithsonian Gardens. I want to thank her for her assistance today. We have our presenter is Sarah Dickert. She's also a lead horticulturist with Smithsonian Gardens. She's going to be talking on gardening with hummingbirds, which we're really excited to hear about today. Also, I want to note that there is closed captioning available. So if you touch the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll be able to see the closed captioning. Also, your microphones are muted, so please keep that in mind. And if you do have questions to share, regarding our presentation today, we will take those at the end and you can load those into the chat. All right, so I'd like to go ahead and get started. So Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And why don't we go ahead and get started?
All right, let's do it. Well, I am excited to be here today. Like Sarah said, my name is also Sarah, and I'm the lead horticulturist at the National Air and Space Museum. And I'll be honest, I feel like gardening for hummingbirds was the perfect topic I felt like for me to talk about. For those of you that follow us on social media, you probably don't remember, but back over the winter on our Instagram, we posted a story asking for suggestions for our Let's Talk Gardens series. And someone had suggested gardening for hummingbirds or hummingbird gardening. And as hopefully you also know, across our campus, we have an exhibit right now called Habitat that talks about protecting our habitats where animals live and wildlife. And at the Air and Space Museum specifically, our exhibit is called Habitat of Flight. And that talks a lot about, in general, about how plants and animals have adapted to their environments where they live, and by using different mechanisms of flight to live in their habitats and their environments, and then how we as humans have taken these things that these plants and animals have come up with to come up with our own inventions and our own innovations. And we actually have an entire panel dedicated to hummingbirds specifically, and the way that they fly and the ways that we have created different inventions to talk about these that kind of relate to these animals. And I realize this might be a little hard to read on the slide, but these are on our website. So if you want to look at them up close and you're not able to visit the garden, you can certainly pull it up on our website, or even better yet, come to the garden and see it for yourself. So I just felt like this was a perfect topic for me to be able to talk to everyone about today. And I hope that whoever suggested that topic on our Instagram is here today to hear about this. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about hummingbirds themselves, because I think understanding kind of who they are as animals and what they do and what their lives are like helps us to put the puzzle pieces together of why we need to do the things we do in our gardens to help them to be successful and to help provide them with the habitats that they like. So one of the things I actually did not realize as I was sort of starting to do some background research on hummingbirds, which unfortunately I'm not an ornithologist, so I do not know all things birds. But what's interesting about them is that they are considered birds of the New World, as in this genus and species of birds only exist in the Americas. So we're talking Canada all the way down to South America. And in total, there's about 300 different species spread out across the Americas. And for us here in the United States specifically, there's about 15 species that are seen in areas that we would know about. On the West Coast, there's 3 different species of hummingbirds. If there's any of you from the West Coast that are joining us today, there's 3 that you'll see most commonly. And those are the Anise, the black-chinned, and the rufous. And then here on the East Coast and really up kind of through the Midwest is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And what's kind of fascinating is that of all the different 15 species that we see sort of in the United States, the ruby-throated is the only one that really exists it is the only one that exists on the East Coast. So we only see one of really the 15 species, which is kind of in of itself is fascinating to me. So for today's discussion, I will say, since Washington, D.C. and Smithsonian Gardens is on the East Coast, a lot of the plants and things that we'll be talking about are sort of specific to either like ruby-throated hummingbirds, or at the very least, those of you who are kind of gardening in kind of the mid-Atlantic or in the South. But there are plenty of resources out there. So if those of you are on the West Coast or even the Midwest, there's plenty of resources out there to get specific plants that might be good for your region. But a lot of the basics about gardening for hummingbird will still be the same. So just some more fun facts about hummingbirds, because I can't help myself but share these with you guys. They have very, very short legs. If you've ever seen them, they're just like these teeny tiny little like things that come out from their bodies. And they actually cannot walk or really hop. They just kind of like shuffle along. They can't walk at all, which is interesting. But I did read a fact that they can actually, despite their legs being very short, they can still like reach them up over their wing to like scratch their head or scratch themselves. Blows my mind that they can't walk, but they can still manage to scratch themselves. I don't understand, but it's pretty awesome. Another thing I think that's very iconic, of course, about hummingbirds is the fact that they can beat their wings so quickly. And so you'll see on my slide that I indicated that they can beat their wings up to 53 times per second. So 1 Mississippi, that's 1 second. It already beat its wings up to 53 times. So over the course of a minute, it can beat its wings 1,000 to 3,000 times, which frankly sounds exhausting, but they can do it. It's the way they live, and it's amazing. And because of how much basically energy they use to beat their wings and to fly, they have one of the highest metabolisms of all animals. I don't know if they have the actual highest, but they're certainly up there. And if you would put that into a human equivalent of calories, that would be almost 150,000 calories a day that they need to live. That's a lot of calories. I certainly can't even fathom trying to eat that many calories. Even people that are in tip-top athletic condition that have to eat way more calories than I do, they would not even come close to that. So it's pretty incredible that these little birds are eating that many calories a day, and that they're able to live, and just how finely tuned their bodies are. And all of that knowing that they only weigh about 3 grams, which is the weight of a penny. So let that sink in for a little. Like teeny tiny, fast metabolisms. I mean, nature is amazing. So I couldn't help myself but include like a little video of them flying. I mean, it's pretty incredible as you're watching this. You almost don't even see its wings. It almost just looks like a body floating in midair, which is just kind of this miracle of nature. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about their migration. So they are one of the birds that migrates. They usually, of the 15 species that we see in the United States, they're in the US to breed, and that's during the summer months, usually like early spring till the fall. And then during the winter months, they migrate to Mexico and Central America for the winter. And then in the process of migrating, or as they're getting ready to migrate, they're going to double their weight in order to prepare for the flight. Because obviously, if you can imagine a bird that's living here in Washington, D.C. for the summer months, has to fly all the way to Mexico, it's gonna need to do some, carb loading, as they say, to get ready for this trip, to make the flight all the way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico. But even for a hummingbird, I have the weight listed there. They go from 3 grams to 6 grams. So they're really only increasing from the weight of a penny to the weight of a nickel. So even that is still pretty incredible to realize that. So I just kind of wanted to give like a little visual of where these birds live, and sort of So you can see on the map kind of on the West Coast and sort of a little bit of the, kind of the Midwest there. You see the Annas and the black-chinned and the rufous. Those are the ones that are going, California and Nevada and Arizona, and then up into Oregon and Washington, also up into Canada, and like very tippy tip, even some of the rufous hummingbirds are going all the way up into Alaska, which is crazy. They're flying the whole way from Alaska down to probably Mexico, or at the very least, maybe Southern California, something like that. And then that big red glob that's there on the right-hand side of the map, that's the range of the ruby-throated hummingbird. So those, I don't know if by kind of population numbers, if there's more of those in comparison to some of the other species that we have in the United States, but certainly they have one of the broadest ranges of all of the hummingbirds. So then, just to put a little bit of a macro lens on ruby-throated hummingbirds, since that's kind of what we're focusing on today, or at least what I'm focusing on, I just wanted to show a little bit more of a specific map for these birds. So again, the red area is where they're spending their summers. That's where they're flying to breed and to have babies and do their thing. The yellow area is areas that if you live in those parts of the United States, that's where you're going to see them as they're migrating. So they may not be spending the summer there, but a good chance that you'll see them kind of flying through. And you might have them stopping, as I said, they have to double their body weight. So they might be looking for a place to stop and to fuel up and get some more food for the rest of their journey. And then down into the blue is down into Mexico and getting into Central America. And that's where they're spending their winters. One of the things I was interesting that I read is that a lot of them that actually go all the way up to Canada for their summer months, a lot of those will actually stay really in kind of the tip of Florida. So they won't quite go the whole way down to Mexico or Central America, but they are certainly going to a place that's warmer and more comfortable for them to live during the winter months. So obviously when we're seeing them in the summer, that's when they're here to breed, and they're making their nests and spending their summer holiday is up where we see them and in our gardens. The pairs do not stay together. The males will simply find a female that they find attractive, and they'll do this really interesting sort of mating dance is the right way, or way of wooing their ladies by doing this U-shaped flying motion in front of a lady, which I have seen it done actually in my parents' garden. And when I first saw it, I thought it was sort of a territorial thing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is that they are kind of territorial. Because it's a very interesting way of flying. It's very specific. When you see it, you will know it. But come to find out, that's really their way of trying to attract the ladies. And I wanted to find a video, and I'm so sorry I couldn't find one that I wouldn't have been making someone mad with copyright laws. But there's plenty of videos on YouTube. If you look up courtship dives of hummingbirds, you'll be able to find videos on the internet that show the hummingbirds doing this like huge U-shaped flying motion that you'll see them doing in the air. Once they've mated, the females will be the ones that make the nest. Like I said, the males leave and they've done their duty, they're gone. They make these just absolutely teeny tiny little nests on a branch. They'll use grasses and plant fibers, and what I thought was really fascinating is they use spider webs, because spider webs are sticky, and they'll use those to sort of hold it all together and to be the glue that like sticks all the plant pieces together to form their nests. Which is especially helpful because when they make a nest, it's literally just on like a flat branch. They're not, a lot of birds will use, maybe like a little V-shaped crotch in a tree branch or something like that to kind of prop their nest up, but they just kind of like glue their nest right onto like the top of a branch. And then as they're making it, or once they're done, they will camouflage the outside of it with lichens or dead leaves or things that make it sort of look like it blends in with the tree branch or with the tree itself. And as you see, I've indicated there, they're usually only like maybe 2 inches across and about 1 inch deep. The other thing that's comes in handy with the spider webs is it actually gives the nest some stretch so that once the babies hatch, there's sort of room for them to grow, that as they're growing and getting bigger in the nest, even though it is quite small and even though they're quite small, the spider web gives the nest a little stretch so that as they're growing, the nest is able to expand out a little bit and take into account the size of the little babies, which I think is so cute and so smart. I mean, come on, little tiny birds, they are so smart. They'll have 1 to 3 eggs that they'll lay per clutch, and some hummingbirds will have 1 to 2 broods per season. So once they have one brood, they may actually find another male, or the male finds them. I don't know which way it goes, and then have possibly a second brood later in the season. So now you have some backstory. We've heard a little bit about what they need, what they like. We're going to get into the nitty gritty because I know that's why you guys are really here, obviously. So food sources is kind of the big ticket item that we're talking about when you're trying to help hummingbirds and attract hummingbirds to your garden. And there are 2 main things that hummingbirds are looking for as food sources. They do eat insects, and then what I think most of us are most familiar with is that they drink nectar. So start with the insects first, since that's kind of the shorter part of the presentation, and then obviously the good stuff is getting into the plants and the nectar sources. So one thing that's really nice is they'll actually catch insects midair, things like mosquitoes and gnats and fruit flies. I mean, mosquitoes alone is a good reason to have hummingbirds in your garden, because I don't think any of us like to invite them into our spaces, good or bad as they may be. I'll just put that out there, but let the hummingbirds eat them, it's fine. They'll also eat spiders, or they'll take advantage of spider webs and insects that get caught in spider webs and eat those. They may also eat aphids, or even like small caterpillars. So that does mean one thing you might want to consider is trying to encourage or at least leave some of the insects in your garden as a potential food source for hummingbirds, which frankly, I just think of that as just being a lazy gardener, because it just means you have to do less work because you don't have to deal with getting the insects out. Just let them do their thing. It's fine. Try to avoid using insecticides. Certainly, if it's something that's like a systemic that's going to be getting into the flower, that though it would be effective at killing the insect, it would also get into the nectar of the flowers, and you don't want to potentially harm these hummingbirds if they're feeding on the nectar of that flower. Obviously, you heard me talk for a couple of slides about sort of what these like fine-tuned little machines they are, and I can only imagine that even having a small dose of insecticide could really harm them. At the very least, if you feel like you can't sort of live with some of the plant damage that you're having, try to choose the least toxic insecticide that you can. So that'd be something like an insecticidal soap or a horticulture oil, something where it's just going to be sort of a contact spray. It would ideally not get into the plant and not be transferred to the hummingbird in any harmful way. And having a diversity of plants, I mean, first of all, is always going to make your garden more beautiful than less beautiful, obviously. But it also helps to encourage insects to come into your garden, both good and bad. Yes, I mean, bad insects are out there and they're going to come into your garden and they're going to nibble some leaves. But if you have a diversity of plants, in theory, you're also encouraging those beneficial insects to come into your garden too. And you're also helping them and supporting all of the insects that we do want to have in our backyards and in our gardens. So, you know, it might be a little bit of a shift in perspective to allow some little nibble holes in your leaves, or if it's, you know, not completely destroying your plant, that, you know, maybe it's okay. Like I said, imperfect is perfect. Letting nature do its thing, and yeah, just letting it go. So now we're going to get into nectar, which is kind of, as I mentioned, I think what we're all most familiar with when it comes to attracting hummingbirds. So just sort of broad scope, we're talking about they prefer red or orange tubular flowers. They'll also use hummingbird feeders, and they do occasionally use tree sap as a source of nectar. So this picture that you're seeing on the slide, that's a really beautiful picture, is from Audubon. He was one of our very famous ornithologists, and this was one of the prints he created to show and demonstrate hummingbirds. And you can see that they're feeding on orange and red shaped tubular flowers. So kind of more specifically about flowers themselves, again, things that are tubular shaped, which makes sense because they have these long skinny beaks, and then they have these cute little tongues that stick out of their beaks, and they go down the shape of go down the flower to feed it the nectar. They are mostly attracted to reds and oranges and pinks, and they do like to prefer flowers that are high nectar. Now that goes a little bit, you may have to do some digging. So some flowers, though they may be red or though they may be orange, they might try them once and then realize like, hey, there is nothing yummy here. There's like a tiny little drop of sugar. I'm not going to waste my time with that. So it's also looking into plants that are going to give them the most bang for their buck. If they're going to spend time with that flower, they obviously want something that's going to give them a good meal. You also want to consider having blooms and flowers that are available throughout the whole season. I mean, they start coming up, at least into our parts, mid-Atlantic, usually like March and April. So you're going to want to have things that are blooming starting really in March if you can, and then going the whole way through till fall, like September, October, so that they have a source of food all summer long, both as they're migrating up into the United States in the spring, while they're here over the summer, and then as they're starting to get ready to migrate and as they're migrating back south. Ideally, you want to use native species when possible. That's always a good idea when it comes to helping our native insects and our native birds. Is always a good idea. But I do feel like there are some exceptions to that, especially when it comes to helping hummingbirds, which you'll see when I start getting into the specific plants. And they are pollinators. They will actually pollinate flowers, which I feel like I knew that or I thought about it, but I had never really considered it that deeply, which I want to talk a little bit about, because I realized as I was even doing my research, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I feel like this is important information that I wanted to share with everybody. And that's talking a little bit about the difference between pollen and nectar. I think those are terms that we as like horticulturists use and throw around a lot, but maybe we don't define them very well. So I just wanted to take at least a little brief moment to sort of talk about the difference. So pollen is, well, usually yellow, not always, but it's sort of this fine powder that has the male parts that are used for fertilizing the flower and fertilizing the female parts, fertilizing the egg. Okay, that's the part that makes us sneeze in the spring when we have allergies. They're made up of fats and proteins in addition to the sexual reproduction parts of it. And so like those proteins are what get up into our nose and irritate our sinuses, and then our body has like a reaction and makes our nose stuffy and our eyes water. So that's what's happening. The pollen is produced on the anthers, which is at the end of the stamen. And then this is something that bees actually do eat, and they collect and use primarily for their young and for their larvae. It's something that they bring back to the nest to give to the queen bee to feed the larvae as they're hatching. And then nectar is a sugary substance, kind of like sugar water, essentially. It's a byproduct of photosynthesis that's used not only to kind of feed the plant, it's something that the plant uses. It also needs carbs and it needs sugar to live its life. And so it uses nectar as a way, specifically as a way to attract pollinators, because they want pollinators to come to their flower. They want pollinators and birds and insects to pick up the pollen from one of their flowers and take it to another plant and spread their genes around as much as possible. But they need to have something that's a reward for them, for a reason for these pollinators or reason for these birds to come to their flower. So they offer them candy. I mean, what plants are so smart? What do you do to bribe your child to like do something? You give them candy. Maybe you don't. You probably don't do that. But you understand what I'm saying. Like they need this reward for insects and birds to convince them to come to their flower and to go to other flowers, maybe on different plants. And it is a source of energy for pollinators because it's sugar. So just to describe sort of what I'm looking at here, and hopefully I'm going to try to get my mouse. Hopefully you guys can see my mouse. If not, I'm really sorry. So on sort of the left hand or the right hand side of the flower, it's circled with like a black circle. There's a lot of parts on this diagram that we're not going to talk about right now, but just wanted to give you a visual. So this is the anther, and that's where the pollen is created. And it's part of the stamen, which you can see kind of in the blown up version. And that's where the pollen is. And then right here is the stigma. So when pollen is collected by pollinators or by a bird or something like that, what's happening is they're foraging for pollen or they're foraging for nectar. They pick up pollen from the anther, and as they go to either the same flower or a different flower, usually their body somewhere is going to touch on the end of the stigma, which is sticky, and then that allows the sperm to go down into the flower and to fertilize the egg that's there. So that's what's happening. And then down here at usually the base of the flower is or somewhere on the flower is the nectary, and that's where the nectar is produced. So it's forcing pollinators to come close to the flower. It's forcing them to really get in there. It's forcing them to move around, to get pollen all over their bodies, and is forcing them then to hopefully get in contact with the stigma, that in the process of getting sugar water, they're hopefully spreading the pollen from one plant to another. So just wanted to tell you kind of that's what's happening. And I know that was a bit of a bunny trail. But that's how hummingbirds are pollinators, is, they're getting very close to the flowers. They're getting close enough to be able to put their beaks down into the tubes of the flowers. And then they're getting pollen on their bodies, on their faces, on their beaks. And then they go from that flower, they fly to the next one, and they're transferring some of that pollen from one flower to the next. And nature is crazy, crazy awesome. Okay, let's talk plants, because I know that's what your guys are most excited about. I just know it. Who isn't, right? So the first, I'm going to kind of go from like trees to shrubs to perennials to annuals. Okay, so first tree is the red buckeye, Aesculus pavia. This is a native tree, does like part shade, some sun. What's really nice about this and why this is a really great tree to consider putting in your garden is that it blooms usually in April and May, which especially if you're more like mid-Atlantic, that's when hummingbirds are coming up into your area, or at the very least migrating through to go perhaps up to Canada. And so having this as a nectar source really early in the spring is very valuable to them. So this is a great tree to have to really catch some of those early hummingbirds when they're getting to your garden or as they're passing through. What's also really nice about this tree is it's on the smaller side, which I know maybe 12 to 15 feet tall doesn't sound that small, but think of it in terms as being, like a cherry tree or a red bud or something like that. Like it's really not, all things considered, that big of a tree. So you don't have to worry about having some giant oak tree or some giant maple tree in your backyard. This is a somewhat more reasonably sized tree to consider adding. The next plant I wanted to feature was rhododendron catabians, which is the catawba rhododendron. This is also a native, and what's great about this is it's evergreen. So this is, I think, really nice to have as sort of a high value aesthetic plant, just like kind of for us, or to have in your garden, to have sort of that evergreen value. But sort of the same thing as the buckeye is it has these early spring blooms. I think a lot of us are kind of familiar with when azaleas and rhododendrons are blooming in our areas, and it's another really nice source of nectar for those plants. One thing to note is that if you are planting them, they do like well-drained soils because they are sort of susceptible to root rot. So if it's something that you're planting, that is one thing to kind of take into consideration. So I think this next plant, Campsis radicans, it's trumpet creeper or trumpet vine, as it's also known, might be the poster child of plants for hummingbirds. I think it's always the #1 plant that's on plant lists when you're doing research about what plants to grow for hummingbirds. It is a native and it's a climbing vine. It does like full sun, blooms midsummer. The somewhat of a downside is that it does like to sucker, as in it likes to send up lots of little babies from the ground and try to just take over as much as it can. So if you like being out in your garden and you just like really just doing things in your garden, this is a great plant because you will always have suckers or little baby plants from the seeds that you can be pulling or trimming back. But they are really beautiful. The colors on them, a lot of times they're red. This one just happens to be a yellow picture, like a picture of a yellow one. But they are a beautiful flower to have in your garden. Just requires some space and perhaps some vigilance. This is probably second on the list after the trumpet vine or trumpet creeper, if you're looking at lists of plants for hummingbirds. And this is a trumpet honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. This is, I do want to be clear, this is a native species of honeysuckle. There are several other species of honeysuckle that are not native, and they are unfortunately highly invasive, specifically Lonicera japonica and Lonicera macchii. For those of you that maybe like to go for walks in the woods or things like that, or even just maybe from your childhoods, remember the beautifully scented yellow honeysuckle that you probably see blooming kind of like maybe a little bit before now, kind of nowish. They smell amazing. They look really pretty, but unfortunately they are invasive and they are taking over a lot of our native habitats. So just be sure that if you're in a garden center that you're shopping for something that is the Lonicera sempervirens, if there's only a cultivar name listed, it might take just a quick Google search on your phone to make sure that it's a cultivar that comes from the native species and not a cultivar that's coming from one of the non-native species. It is a climbing vine if it's given support. If it's not given support, it'll just kind of like sprawl all over the ground. But if you give it a trellis or a fence or something like that, it will climb it. The one downside, perhaps for us, is that they aren't fragrant. So if you're looking for a fragrant honeysuckle, this one's not going to fit the bill. But it is going to attract hummingbirds, and they are beautiful flowers. They're blooming right now. We have several plants of it at our Natural History Museum, in our bird garden, probably specifically to attract hummingbirds. And it is great to have. It just doesn't have the nice scented flowers. But you know what? You can get some great honeysuckle scented candles. I'm just saying, there's some great ones out there. Like I said, blooms about now. I've seen them blooming at our Natural History Museum. And then later in the summer and the fall, it does produce berries that are also enjoyed by other birds that enjoy eating berries on plants. Next up is Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower. This is, again, another native, and this is getting into our perennials. It does like full sun. For those of you that maybe live in like the deep South or the Midwest, or at least like kind of the southern Midwest, they might need a little bit of afternoons shade so they don't get totally toasted. But for the most part, they take full sun. They do like wetter soils, though they'll be okay in dry soils, but they like having a little bit of more, I want to say constant moisture. I don't want to say they like being in a swamp or having their feet wet all the time, but they do like sort of having regularly wet soil. So it's kind of perfect for around raid gardens or ponds, things like that. It is not actually named after the bird cardinal, and it does not, unfortunately, attract cardinals in any way. The name, which I did not realize this until I was kind of figuring out what to talk about Lobelia, is that it actually comes from the red robes worn by Roman Catholic cardinals. Interesting. Fun fact, just put that out there. So the really like blurry picture that's up on the like kind of like the right, the little one on the right, that's a lobelia in my backyard. And you can see the little hummingbird going to it. I do have hummingbirds in my backyard, but they are very difficult to photograph. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of my own personal pictures that I was able to put in here because they move by the time I get to the window, or I'm trying to zoom on my phone. So but I just wanted to prove so you all knew for sure they do like lobelia. They visited that lobelia quite frequently, and I'm looking forward to when the lobelia blooms to have the hummingbirds visit it again. Another great plant is monardas, and there's several different species listed here, and there's also tons of cultivars and hybrids of monardas that you can use. So these are just the straight species, but when you're in garden centers, you'll probably see a lot of the cultivars and a lot of the hybrids that have been created with monardas over the years. They are a native. They are in the mint family, which is worth noting. So a lot of times they do spread. So it may require some every couple of years, kind of like taming it back and cutting some out, pulling some out. They do remove pretty easily. But just kind of a note, some of the older ones, or if you are getting straight species, especially of the scarlet bee balm, like the one that's pictured here in this picture, is prone, unfortunately, to powdery mildew. So, and some of the other ones are too. So just something to note that you want to, if you can, plant it in an area with good airflow in your garden. And also, if you can, actually try not to let your soil dry out, because that basically what happens is it stresses the plant, and then the plant is like, oh, I stress, and then it contracts powdery mildew. And you can also deadhead them to kind of help prolong the blooms, which will only help the hummingbirds by having those blooms for as long into the season as possible. Next is Agastache, which some of you may know as Anise Hyssop. I did not put any species here because pretty much any species or any Agastaches that you find in garden centers are either straight species or hybrids or cultivars of native ones. So there's a couple that are native to like Texas and Mexico, in addition to ones that are native to like the Northeast. So, but pretty much anything is at least native to the United States. And so you can really find, there are some that have like the red and orange and pink flowers, which obviously would be sort of preferred by the hummingbirds. But they can see in the ultraviolet spectrum in addition to full color. So even things that are purple flowers, or maybe not necessarily the reds and the oranges, they're still going to see it. And if they know that there's that high nectar, that high value for going to that flower, they'll learn that very quickly, and then they'll go to the plants. They like full sun. They really bloom all summer. They're a long blooming perennial, which is wonderful. And you can also deadhead these to help prolong the blooms. Next is Liatris spicata, blazing star, another native, full sun. What I love about this one is that it has really great texture to the garden. So even though you may be planting it with the intention of attracting hummingbirds, it's also going to just like look really cool in your garden to have this there. So I feel like that's definitely a double bonus. Then we have Aquilegia canadensis, or columbine. This is another native that blooms on the earlier side, so similar to the buckeye and similar to the rhododendron that I talked about kind of at the beginning of the plants here, is that they're blooming early spring, April, May-ish, when hummingbirds are migrating or coming into our gardens for the season. And so this is a really valuable nectar source for them. And what I learned that was super fascinating about this that I did not know, hopefully you guys can see my mouse again, is that the nectar is actually held up here in these like little bulbs are at the top of the flower. And this is an adaptation that, I mean, who knows when it occurred, millions of years ago, thousands of years ago, I'm not sure, that the plant adapted in order to specifically attract hummingbirds, and also probably hummingbird moths, which are they're an insect. They look a lot like hummingbirds, but they also have a very long proboscis. They also have a very long tongue. So this is something specifically adapted by this flower to attract hummingbirds to pollinate their flowers, because what happens is the hummingbird comes down here with their beak and their bodies, and they're putting their tongue and their beak up into the flower to try to get to these nectar bulbs, and their bodies are brushing up against the anthers where the pollen is, and then they fly to the next flower and they're doing the same thing, and in the process they're passing that pollen from one flower to the next. So definitely another example of how nature is just so cool. Very similarly, this is Impatiens capenensis, or jewelweed. Now this is native, but it's actually an annual. So you'll find this a lot of times in woodlands, and you'll see very large patches of it. It does colonize. but it reseeds. It's from reseeding. So even though it's an annual, it just will keep really coming back in the same place because of the seed that it's sowing. And this also is another one that has sort of a similar adaptation as the columbine did. You can kind of see these are what are called nectar spurs. And so this is another sort of specific adaptation that like really only hummingbirds or perhaps the hummingbird moths are able to reach their tongues into the flower and get their tongues into this in order to reach the nectar, and in the process they're pollinating from one plant to the next because of the way their bodies are coming in contact with the pollen. It does like moisture or wet soils, and it does like full shade. So if you have a shady garden, like a wet shady garden, this might be the perfect place for you, or perfect plant. Another one, Spigelia. This is called Indian pink. This is another native one. It blooms kind of in June. So we have some at the Air and Space Museum, and they're just now starting to bloom, or at least the buds are forming and they're starting to see some of the signs of red. So they're kind of like a late spring, early summer. Nice plant. Another good plant for part to full shade. And then we have a bulb, which is fun. I want to throw this in here. This is actually a native bulb, Lilium canadense. And this is, you see this a lot of times in woodlands, just naturally occurring, or like openings in woodlands, I should say, because they like full sun to part shade. They do like moist soil and bloom in midsummer. So I know for sure natives are always going to be the best choice, but I do want to talk about annuals. What's nice about annuals is that they provide nectar and sources of food for really a very long time. Most annuals will bloom the whole way from when you put them in the ground, early May, something like that, all the way through till you get frost in the fall, which by then the hummingbirds have most likely migrated and have, or at least are making their way back south again for their winter areas. So salvias are one of my favorite annuals to use in the garden. They are just prolific bloomers. They get really nice and big and colorful. They're just really great performers. So I have a couple of different species listed. Some they're sort of native-ish. They almost like, even though they're kind of an annual, they kind of cross over into natives, and also depending on where you live in the United States, they might actually be hardy for you, which is why I have them listed as tender perennials or annuals. So for example, the salvia that's in this picture is a variety of the Salvia gargan. Oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce it because now's not the time for me to sound out Latin names on a PowerPoint, but the friendship sage. And this is Salvia amistad. This is one that I use regularly in the gardens. And for us in DC, in the Mid-Atlantic, it is a tender perennial, which means if we have a good warm spot in the garden, this will often return for us as a perennial. But I would suspect getting much kind of north of us into Maryland or Pennsylvania, this will probably just be an annual. But it is very popular by hummingbirds, even though it is purple. These come a lot of times as a purple color flower. The hummingbirds, if they try it out, they will find that this is a high nectar plant and that it is valuable for them, and they will come to it. So some of the other salvias that are there, like the Texas sage or the autumn sage, those are some of the ones that might be more of a perennial and somewhat less of an annual, but again, might take a little research on your part to see if it's going to be hardy in your area of the United States, or if it's really just an annual. And then I have zinnias. I mean, I think zinnias are a very classic annual that most of us are familiar with. I really wanted to use this picture because it's really interesting to show you that the actual flower of zinnias are the little tiny yellow things in the center. So the petals are what are really what are attracting the pollinators in. That's what's catching their eye. That's the part that's pink and red and orange. And then once they get close, they discover that the real flowers and the real petals are the little yellow things that run around the circle that bee is visiting in this picture. These are also kind of native, for those of you that live kind of more in the south, the creeping zinnia is actually native to your area. It's not hardy for us once we kind of get up into the mid-Atlantic, but a lot of the annuals that we use in the mid-Atlantic are hybrids between the common zinnia and the creeping zinnia. So it's something that we do use a lot. I have it in the gardens at Aaron Space this year. They're really good performers. They do like full sun. I would recommend, if you're planting zinnias, if you're familiar with them, to try to get ones that are more what I'm going to call a single flowering variety. You may be familiar with the ones that are kind of like these little like domed puffballs. Those are a little bit harder because of all the petals that are on them to create something that's really visually interesting for us. It does make it a little bit harder for pollinators to find the flowers that are in there. It's not impossible. They'll find it. They're very resourceful, but something that's kind of a little bit more like the zinnia you see in this picture. It's a little more obvious, and it's a little easier for them to have a place to land and take a break and you know, go for the pollen and to feed on the pollen, or to feed on the nectar, excuse me, feed on the nectar. And the last plant on the list is fuchsia. I think this is, again, somewhat of an old-fashioned plant, but that does not mean it's a bad. It's really a great annual. I remember growing up, my parents always had a hanging basket of fuchsia on our deck because we had shade. Since I was little, I have no idea if hummingbirds ever found them, but in theory, that's what they were going for, I'm sure. These are native generally to Central and South America, so not necessarily native to the United States. But again, it's something that's going to attract them. It's going to provide a food source for these hummingbirds. They're not invasive in our area, so there really shouldn't be any concern with them escaping our gardens and getting into native areas where they shouldn't be. For us, they're annuals. If you're in the southern United States, especially the Bonestead varieties, like Gartenmeister, something like that, those ones are kind of almost more shrubby and more upright than some of the ones that are hanging that you find a lot of times in hanging baskets. And those actually might be hardy enough to survive the sort of a tender perennial in the South. And they do like kind of part shade, part sun. But they're another good, tough performer for us. So now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk at all about hummingbird feeders, because I think that's something else that a lot of us use or would be interested in using in our gardens to attract them. What's nice is it's just super reliable. It's very straightforward. It's very easy. You can get them very inexpensively, which is nice. And for those of you that may not really have a garden space to be putting in a lot of those plants that I was just talking about, you know, you can put these on just like a little hook, or on my next slide, I'll show you as a picture of the hummingbird feeder that I have, which actually just suction cups onto a window. So if you just live in an apartment, in theory, you could just suction it onto the outside of one of your apartment windows and have hummingbirds come and visit you. As you're shopping for them, you do want to find one that's easy to take apart and clean. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but because you're putting sugar water in them, unfortunately, that does cause them to sometimes grow like mold and bacteria. So you want to be able to clean it, and you want something that you can take apart and clean. And you want to choose a feeder that has either a red base or like the red colored ports where they're going to be feeding. As we know, they do like the color red, so that's what's most attractive for them. And if the feeder that you have maybe doesn't have a lot of red on it, I've seen some that are very beautiful, made out of glass and metal, and they're really pretty, kind of garden ornamentation, but that's maybe not going to attract to the hummingbirds that much. You can add some red. So this picture was actually from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute down in Panama. So they must have put up some hummingbirds to try, or feeders to attract hummingbirds that they have there. And you can see that the base is it's pretty small and there's not a lot of red. So they clearly added that red ribbon to really catch the hummingbird's eye and draw them in so that it would be interested in feeding at their feeder. You do want to change the water that's in the feeders every 2 to 3 days. It gets hot and it gets gross pretty fast. And you don't want to do that to hummingbirds. And when it gets gross, they don't come to the feeder. If it gets gross, they will stop coming. And I don't blame them. Who wants to drink gross, moldy water? You also do want to make sure that you're cleaning the feeder every time you fill it, not just topping it off. Again, trying to get the gross stuff out. You can clean it just with some like mild dish detergent, or I also saw a recommendation of just some vinegar mixed with some water just to kind of get it cleaned. You can buy specialty brushes to kind of help clean the like little ports, which are very small. So there's different things you can kind of buy to help clean them, and just making sure that it's rinsed really well before refilling it so that you're not kind of giving them like soapy sugar water. Oh, and I realized this is my bird, before I skip it, that's the hummingbird feeder that I have at my house. It's on my living room window, so you can see, again, it's a nice blurry picture for you guys to look at, about as clear as the pictures I got from last summer. And you can see a hummingbird visiting it, and it's actually just so fun. Like, I sit on my couch across from the window, and especially in the evenings, the hummingbird really comes to it pretty frequently to feed, and it's such a delight. It's such a nice thing to sit and see these little guys coming to your window. So really the easiest thing to do is to make your own nectar. So the recipe, I guess we'll call it, that I saw most frequently online was 1 part granulated sugar to 4 parts of water. So just kind of an easier math, we're talking a 1/4 cup of sugar dissolved into a cup of water. You can, some of you may be familiar or know about, have heard about boiling the water, which you can do if you're making like a large quantity, and then what you want to do is refrigerate it then if you make a large quantity, or if you're going to put it in your feeder right away. If you're not using like a lot or making a lot, you don't have to boil it. That's not really necessary, although I would recommend, just on like a personal note, maybe just using slightly warm water, because that'll help the sugar dissolve better into the water. You really do not need, and probably shouldn't add, red food coloring. You don't know if that's going to have a reaction for them, if they're going to, if that's going to have effect on their tiny little bodies, use red food coloring. And that's really not what's attracting them anyway. It's not the red nectar, it's the red of the base, because you got to think in terms of the base is like the petals of a flower, and the nectar in flowers is clear. So that's not something they're used to looking for anyway. So you don't need to even add red food coloring. I mean, you saw the liquid that was in my feeder was clear, and they came all the time, no issues. Which also means you don't really need to buy the commercial mixes that you see in garden centers or like bird food, like bird supply stores. You can really just make your own. I mean, they're essentially just selling you sugar anyway, which you probably already have sitting around in your kitchen. You also don't want to use honey or any other kind of like sugar syrups, like corn syrup or anything like that, because that will definitely harbor bacteria and mold growth that can really make the hummingbirds sick. And since you're going to be changing the water every few days anyway, you really only want to fill it with as much water as your hummingbirds are going to use over the course of like 2 or 3 days. Then you're not making as much. You can kind of make smaller batches at a time, which is kind of nicer for you. And it's just, I mean, why put in more than what they're going to eat? Try not to place it in full sun if you can. That's you're going to speed up the process of the water getting gross. But sometimes you don't have a choice. It just may mean you might have to change your water like every 2 days instead of every 3 days. And I sort of mentioned this earlier in the presentation that hummingbirds are territorial. So if you're noticing that you're getting more and more hummingbirds into your garden, what you want to do is actually put out more hummingbird feeders and not just larger ones. They would much rather be spread out across perhaps 2 or 3 feeders instead of multiple hummingbirds coming to a very large feeder with a lot of different ports on it, because they just like to eat by themselves. They like to just be solo feeders, or only the company of one nice individual maybe. What's nice about hummingbirds is, or what's nice about feeders is that it can, I think ornithologists are starting to see that, it might be something that's kind of becoming more necessary, as unfortunately we're losing some of our native habitats. And as people might have backyards with just a lot of grass and boxwoods, there's nothing there for the hummingbirds to eat. But at the very least, if you're putting out a feeder, there's something for them to eat. There's something for them to live on, especially as they're migrating. And it's also been kind of proven at this point that there's really no evidence that having a feeder out late into the fall will prevent them from migrating south. The hummingbirds, their indicators for moving south is really by day length. So they're going to start moving south whether you still have a feeder out in your garden or not. And actually having it out later in the fall is really providing a source for those hummingbirds to get food, because they're doubling their body weight. They're trying to build up as much energy as possible. So whether it's a hummingbird that's been in your garden all summer, or as they're migrating through, giving them something to eat. And if you give them food, they will return. They will remember when they come back the next year that your garden is the place to be, that that's where they want to hang out for their summer months. So the more you put out food, the more you put out flowers, the more they're going to find you and want to hang out there. And last but not least, just wanted to talk a little bit about some other things. They do like to bathe in fine mists. Remember, they have tiny little legs. They cannot bathe in traditional bird baths, or else they would just, I don't know if they drown, but they would be not happy. So they like to fly through fine mists. So you can get these little adapters for your bird bath to create like a mist for them to fly through. You can also be a lazy gardener. Don't worry about the insects and don't worry about cleaning up in the fall or in the spring. Just leave it all there. Providing bits of plant debris for them in your garden gives them something to use to make their nests. You can also buy what I have pictured here, these little cages that have untreated cotton fibers in them that they also will use sometimes as a substitution for spider webs to help make their nest. So those are just two little extra things you can add to your garden in addition to having plants. With that, I think I have covered everything from A to Z about hummingbirds. And thank you for joining. I have some additional resources there, ones that I used from Audubon and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Certainly local extension agencies are going to be a great source of information, master gardener groups, if you're trying to get more specifics. But yeah, so if you're looking for more information, and follow us on social media. We like seeing your pictures. Come visit us.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was such a deep dive into gardening for hummingbirds. I learned a lot, especially about the spider web as like the glue, and then as the babies get bigger it expands like a pantyhose. I think that's so cool. I totally learned something new today. We do have time for just a couple questions. There's a couple questions that have come through the chat. Probably the first one I'd like you to address is, when you say native, do you need native to the North America? Like when you say native, what range are you talking?
I would say at least native to North America, especially since we do have hummingbirds. And I don't know where all of you are from that are listening right now. Native to North America, I think being able to have plants that are at least adapted to a North America sort of climate and habitats are going to always be preferential to something, you know, maybe from Europe or Africa or Asia or something like that. So it's a broad scope. If you want to get really specific to something native to your, you know, your state or your region, there's certainly resources out there to find what those plants are. But I kind of left it a little bit more broad so that you can have a full scope of plants at your plant palette list as you're going shopping.
No, that's great. And then we have a couple questions more about just the feeders themselves. So like me, I have hummingbird feeders and hummingbirds in my garden, and I've always carbo loaded them at the beginning. So I make my juice a little more rich with sugar. Is that bad? And someone asked also about, what about the additives in tap water? Will that hurt hummingbirds? And then someone else asked a question regarding, like, how do you get rid of ants? And for me, I have a lot of problems with bees in the late season. So those are a couple of things we'd like you to address.
Okay, so the first one, like carbo loading in the spring and probably in the fall, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. To be honest, I had been using a mixture of like a 1-to-2 ratio. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think just probably they've done research and found that a 1-to-4 ratio is still sufficient, but I don't think having more is bad. I don't know if you need to, certainly I probably wouldn't do more than say a half a cup of sugar to a cup of water. That might be a little too sugary. I mean, they're already buzzing enough. How much more sugar do they need? Like they'll just like explode, the poor little things. Ants are tricky. You can get, if you have yours hanging from like a hook or something, You can get these like little cups that actually go between the hook and where the hummingbird feeder is actually hanging, that you fill with water. But the idea is that, you know, ants are climbing up your hook and they're coming around, and that they get caught in the water before they make their way around to the hummingbird feeder. I will be quite honest, mine is hanging on a window, and I have used like the bait traps that I'll put like in my little window well to try to like catch their attention before they make their way up to my hummingbird feeder. But I do have ants in my hummingbird feeder occasionally. Bees, I don't know if I have a good solution for bees. I don't think they're harmful. I don't know if they get in the way of hummingbirds or if they scare them off at all.
I see them fight a lot. They're like fighting.
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't know how to keep another flying insect away from a feeder. That I don't know. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
Maybe
that's
someone out on, maybe someone else out on the internet has a solution for that. I'm sorry, I don't have it.
No, thank you so much, Sarah. That was so informative. And I just love your enthusiasm. You're so enthusiastic about gardening and birds. And just thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Sure.
So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. A recording from today's webinar and our plant list will be available on our website within the next few weeks. If you're interested in learning more about our weekly webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens, our website has over 30 recordings available for viewing. So there's a lot. Sarah's featured in several of them, so it's always fun to see her. I want to thank also my co-host, Sarah Dickert, for helping with this presentation. Of course, Sarah, who's our presenter you know, we've got 3 Sarahs on the call today. We've got all the Sarahs that work for Smithsonian Gardens on the call, so it's a little confusing. Thank you, Sarah Dickert, for your presentation. Thank you, Sarah Thibault, for your co-hosting. And I just wanted to mention that next week we're featuring the program Made in the Shade, Creating Dynamic Shade Gardens. So please join us. And I also wanted to mention that the Smithsonian is reopening. So we have reopened several of our museums, and we plan to open all of the Smithsonian museums by the end of August. So please come join us in the gardens if you're able to, or see us online, and we'd love to see you next week. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.